All right. I recently did a talk with Philip Chase, which was so fun. We got to talk about a whole bunch of things like Malazan, like his book, like writing in general. Beowulf came up, and it was really, really fun. And he asked me about what I was working on, what I've been writing, and I gave a lot of the history of kind of what led me into wanting to write it, but then I was quite vague on some of the details about how to kind of sell what I have been writing, because I didn't want to sell it at that moment, even though I still wanted to talk about it because it's been so a part of things, but I just wasn't super prepared for how I was going to bring it up. And I figure I might as well at least give some of the themes and what I'm writing about and what I have been writing about for the last 3 years. Because, I don't think I wanted to keep it so close to my chest because it just was, it was just a private thing. But I think it's okay to give an idea of what it is. Now, I will, and that talk with him isn't out yet. That'll be probably next week or something like that. But I had mentioned that it all started with this idea that I had, where I wanted to write a book for my kid, just a funny book for myself. And I had this stupid idea, which has blossomed from that, but I had this idea of writing this story of just a dopey guy, like basically me, but for something that my kids would recognize is clearly me. Now it's gone from that into something totally different, but it started out where they always laugh at how not flexible I am, and I pretend to do like head kicks and it only goes like this high, and they just think that kind of stuff is funny. Just really bragging when I totally anyway, like we went to this ostrich farm where my cousins have the ostrich farm. If you heard about those ostriches that got loose and were running around in a Canadian town, that was my cousin just down the road. And I went and I hopped on one of these ostriches just to ride it, and I biffed it so hard just to make them laugh. And I wanted to do something that had that sort of energy, that they could read it and it would be stupid and whatever. And I had this silly little hook with it, which doesn't mean anything. And I'm not going to say where it went with it because I still have an element of it. But this stupid little hook that he had, one little hair coming out of his belly button. They think my belly button lint is gross, and I lean into it as a kind of a gross dad for them, just being like, does anyone want this? And so I had this story about this guy who had one nasty, dumb little hair, and it can't pull off. And sometimes he would do these different things, like he would sometimes get it stuck in like a blender or something, and it would just yank at, just silly, absurd, just ridiculous, nothing. Now, it has really turned into something much, much different, more fantasy. And I still have a character with a hair in their belly button, but it's just expanded into something else, and that is not the main feature anymore. Now, what it is, we have, and I'll stick some pictures on. I've done it a little bit in the past. Now, these are AI generated that I made earlier to kind of help me while I was writing, and I would have them kind of on the walls and things, and I'd have them close by so that I always kind of got the feel of what I was trying to write, kind of the atmosphere. Now, this is like many other books. This is many, 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 many centuries after some, it's a time forgotten. And the time forgotten, the lore kind of surrounding it is very much kind of a Brothers Grimm sort of feel to it. They're not sure what's real, but people are turning into ravens and things, and they're just strange stuff like that. Very fantastical with kings and stuff, even though there's no kings anymore. And there is this kind of plateau area. If you saw on a map, a big kind of plateau, and then sheer cliffs. I got that idea initially from watching The Princess Bride with the Cliffs of Insanity. Imagine the Cliffs of Insanity surrounding this very large kind of region, and they watch to make sure nobody comes up. They kind of guard it, and it's this own sort of kingdom, even though it's not really a kingdom. And I showed images of a cliff. I showed images of this cage. At one point in their history, they would take the criminals or whatever, and they would place them in these cages, and they would deposit them down below where they couldn't come up anymore. And sometimes also they would bring them down just as a punishment, bring them down for a second or two, just dip it down below, and then bring it back up. And when they would come up, they would be totally crazy, not themselves at all, as if they've had this full crazy experience down there. And also there's this element of it where if somebody is afflicted with something, think of like a werewolf. If somebody was bitten by a werewolf, they would think, let's get rid of the werewolf. And now this person also can't be up here with us. And so it turns out that there's just all this happening in their history. You see some of these cages still around. There are magical cages that are for like the worst criminals, where they drop them down and nothing would be able to break out of the cage or break into it, and they're just stuck there. Now that is kind of what was happening up above at one time, and there was all sorts of things. And the reason for this change of landscape as well is there were some different crises and stuff to deal with. So you can kind of make some ideas of, or imagine maybe what sort of things that would be. But think of, even though it was kind of a Brothers Grimm mythology, think of stuff from old Gothic monster movies like vampires. And even though it's not necessarily that, but think of that sort of vibe of that sort of thing sweeping into this old kingdom and really changing everything. And many crises that they had to kind of deal with that and contain it, but at what cost? And that's what I've been working on. So up above is this plateau, but everything down below, even below the clouds, it's that high up. Everything below the clouds is this forest. And think of like an enchanted forest, because it really does sort of respond that way, where most of the people are living in this forest down below. And there are pockets within the forest of communities, but most of the people are generally just surviving as best they can, because the things below are very much like one of these Gothic horror kind of monster settings. And yeah. And so I've spent a lot of time with many different people down below in this kind of monster setting world, where I remember seeing the extended editions of Lord of the Rings, and where J.R.R. Tolkien said, this could be an allegory for some people, but it is not intended for that. And I'm sure people, when they see some of my stuff, what I've been working on, will get some of that. But it's the same sort of thing that I love when I read Steven Erikson. I just love that sort of, not allegory, but there are metaphors that could be taken any which way. So there is some of that. And this forest, though, is very odd. Time works differently down there, which also kind of gives a hint for the people being dropped below at one point, then coming up and they're just like crazy. There's different, you can get lost very easily. which, that's not a big thing. But I mean, in an enchanted way. If you turned a corner and looked back, you might be in a totally different place. So there are different types of people down there just struggling to survive. And a lot of them are children. And imagine having a child who had something like the werewolf condition or a vampire condition, or there are people also who kind of turn into stone during the daytime, turn back, and then the night comes and they're back. In the day, they're stone, and that sort of thing where they're dealing with that, but slowly they're kind of more turning into stone. And it is, there is somebody who turns up into this forest, and that really is one of our core characters for a lot of these people who are big time struggling down in this forest will kind of converge on this character. But I am planning a 3-part thing. One of my, I mentioned the guy with the hair. He's definitely in it, and one of the parts that I had prepared for him is definitely in it. So there are some laughs, but I really love when there are some. For some reason, I like a dark setting. And I've mentioned that I think that's why I've vibed so well with Malazan, because it's quite dark. But though it's dark, that makes a great conduit for things that I think are really beautiful and light. So even though it's that dark setting, really it's about all these different types of experiences that people are having. It's not so much an epic, even though there are a lot of things happening, but it's very much about those small little moments. And I don't know if that's even explaining it very well at all. But yeah. One of the things that I have also been working on with it, or kind of what has driven me, is I've spent a lot of time trying to get in the hearts and the minds of these people who would be down there. And you go to some very odd places. You go to some very strange places when you're trying to get into that headspace of what that could be like. I mentioned that Frankenstein is the character that I think about the most. And so I've tried to give that sort of thought to other characters who are going through something, who have been thrown into something that is not necessarily their fault. And I will just say there is a vampire type of affliction where, to deal with it, they would just sort of lock these guys away in tunnels and sometimes just forget about them. And a part of, instead of vampires that are needing to suck blood and things like that, even though they have some of the same sort of characteristics of that, they have, one of the things is they've sort of been able to quell some of that part of them, so they are not totally beholden to it, which I am so happy that I'm reading what I'm reading right now with Reaper's Gale, because it has some of that dual nature as well. But imagine somebody came across one of these tunnels or heard a child and opened up this thing, and there was this child living in this burial place, and which is a perfect series that I'm reading about right now. And it's, anyway, imagine what you would do if you saw somebody very vulnerable and really kind of immortal in some ways, that it doesn't have to, it can survive just buried in a tunnel and things like that. But since they are vampires, they could, or not vampires, but since they have that kind of quality to them, also a part of their character is that they are totally kind of chill, just laying there, sometimes for centuries. So who knows how long they've just been chilling in these places, sometimes completely alone, going through these different things where they've just been sometimes going crazy, but sometimes just waiting. And I don't know, that's very vague, But that is something that I have been exploring for a few years. And what would happen if a character who was already feeling a certain way about themselves with this past ran into a couple children, especially who really could use help, were dangerous but very also very vulnerable because of their particular sort of affliction. Anyway, it has that dichotomy of the upper and lower, and things that people are dealing with, these different sorts of elements that are within them. They have scars often on their bodies, sometimes scars within themselves. There's element of people trying to figure out what has happened with this place and how long things have been like this. And yeah, I've found it really fun, and fun casting people into it, but fun also kind of bringing this big storyline that started with something so stupid, but has really, really been a part of what I've loved doing. And I have this idea I would like to potentially have all these perspectives be in their own little self-contained book, at least for the first thing, so that even though they are having these different experiences, again, think of the Brothers Grimm, which is a big part of my life. Think of these different stories that you could read and you could get their whole story. But unless you read all of them, you don't get the whole story. So I'm thinking of how I'm going to do that. Even if it's just like 10 perspectives, very small individually, but then when things start to converge, then it's more the traditional way. I'm not sure. But right now I'm focused on writing these individual stories, and then I will decide how to kind of mesh them properly as they kind of get to know each other. But I think people will find it heartfelt and personal, and they will hopefully find some of that metaphor that I love so much. I hope people will find it hilarious, because I think some of the situations are hilarious, but you never know. Sometimes, I will always go for a laugh when I can get that. But also, I hope that people find it very sweet and good, and a lot of light, but still has some of that really cool fantasy element, which and also some of that gothic monster violence that I'm excited to write into it as well. So that's that, and I don't know if that was helpful or interesting, but that has been such a big part of my life right now, and I have adored going through Malazan to see how he has explored some things that are very, very parallel, and I've just loved seeing his take on that as well. So I will talk to you on the next one, whenever that is.